All right. Next, I want to move on and talk about some of the human or cultural or environmental issues, we could say, because some of these are combinations of humans and the physical environment, and talk particularly about population, food, and other challenges. So I want to rewind back and talk a little bit about the ice ages. And this is showing the extent of ice during the ice ages, an era period we call the Pleistocene. Next, I want to show a chart showing the differences in temperature going back over, say, 100,000 years. And prior to about 10,000 years ago, you can see these dips and these erratic changes in the climate. And from about 10,000 years on, it's much more warm and stable. So we have a different climate. We've had a different climate for the past 10,000 years than we did prior to 10,000 years ago. Prior to 10,000 years ago, we were in the Pleistocene, more commonly known as the Ice Ages, where we're currently out of the Ice Ages and in a period called the Holocene. All right, so Pleistocene was about 2.5 million years and lasted till about 10,000 years ago. And the Holocene is this period beyond that. And one thing I should note is that humans have been around pretty much throughout this period. We don't have a lot of recorded history prior to the Holocene during the Ice Ages, but humans, we do find archaeological evidence and know that people have been around and moving and around the Earth. And so there's been between these time periods, there have been changes in how humans produce food. And during the Paleolithic period, what we often call the Stone Age, a lot of that being in that Pleistocene Ice Age period. And this didn't all stop at once, but mostly during that time, for most of human history, humans have been hunters and gatherers. And what that means is they had to use extensive areas, that you really had to forage over a much wider area of land than you would as a farmer. Now, as a farmer, you can use a very small area of land and produce your food, but if you're having to, get a fish here and a berry there, you're gonna have to forage over a large area. And that really limited the number of people who could live together, because you really only had enough food in your local environment to support maybe a small group of perhaps 8 to 12 people. And you really couldn't get in, you couldn't really have human groups much bigger than these small, what we might call a band of people. And one thing that changed, particularly during the Holocene, is that with more stable temperatures, people would have been able to grow their own food. And this is called the Neolithic period, kind of the New Stone Age, where you had what's called the agricultural revolution, sometimes called Neolithic revolution, or even food producing revolution. And this is where domestication takes place, where people learn that they can instead of just foraging for plants, they can replant the seeds and grow the food themselves where they live. And over time, they can select the best ones of these plants, the best seeds, and kind of change the food over time. And this really changed a lot for people, because it changed what we call the carrying capacity. How many people could live in a particular area. That was raised dramatically, because people, instead of having to forage over a wide area, they could use this very small area, but use it much more intensely.